You hear about mental illness and suicide a lot more these days, especially if you follow this podcast. But are things actually getting better or worse? We live in a time with more awareness and acceptance of mental health issues than ever, yet it's not obvious all the attention is moving the needle in the right direction. Youngblood exists to share the stories of everyday men, and that won't change. But my guest today brings us the facts and a unique perspective you won't find anywhere else. Professor Nicholas Procter is Australia's representative to the International Association for Suicide Prevention Council. He literally wrote the textbook for mental health education in this country and has dedicated his long career to mental health research. In other words, he is the man when it comes to suicide prevention.
When we have reasons for living, and when we're clear about that, we're less likely to take actions that put our reasons for living at risk. And reasons for living could be about going back to school, finishing year 12, it could be about going to university, getting married one day, having children, getting my car back on the road. It could be a whole range of things.
In this conversation, you'll learn what's at the core of so many men taking their lives and the progress our society is actually making in this area. We'll cover what does and doesn't work in managing our mental health, the impact of suicide bereavement on those left behind, and is the system truly broken? Find out all that and more on the Youngblood Expert Series.
Welcome to Youngblood, the award-winning volunteer podcast dedicated to young men's mental health. My name's Callum McPherson, I'm a journalist, and this is a platform for everyday men to share lived experience stories and show that no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Suicide is the number one killer of young people, and changing that starts with speaking up. So let's do it. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a thing. Help us reach more people by taking 10 seconds to give the show a rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you've got some feedback on this conversation, I'd love to hear it. You can vote in the poll and leave a comment on every Spotify episode. I read them all. This show touches on some tough topics that may provoke strong emotions. If you find anything in this chat distressing, please do whatever you need to do to look after yourself.
Professor, I think if you were to ask the average person if they think suicide rates are going up or going down or staying the same, that a lot of them would probably say that they're increasing. Is that actually the case?
There are some increases in some groups across Australia right now. So particularly in relation to younger people and older adults, they seem to be the two groups where increases are being seen. And then, of course, there's suicidal behaviour, so history of self-harm, and there are some increases in those rates across Australia. The other thing to say about rates is that they do move around, and we tend to think of suicide rates in terms of trends. So when we see a trend over a period of time, we can then be more confident in the commentary, if you like, that goes with explaining differences or changes in rates.
So what sort of increases are we talking about?
They're marginal increases. So if we look at the older adult, for example, people over the age of 85, there's been an increase, and then there are gender increases. So with people over 85 who are men, there are increases there. We've also seen, very concerningly, an increase in young people aged under the age of 15 who are dying by suicide. That has been a trend that has been reported for a few years now, and that's a real concern for a lot of people. So those are the sorts of changes that we've seen. When numbers are released, so around October each year, they're always retrospective. So as the numbers are released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare make their commentaries and descriptions around those numbers.
They're not quite up to date.
They're always retrospective, and they're always tentative. And the reason they're tentative, and this is another reason why numbers do move, is as decisions are made about missing persons, for example, or other events that have happened, there'll be adjustments made to those numbers across states. So these are the kinds of things that also move numbers.
What about rates for young men, so say 15 to 44?
So they have been fairly stable, but they are still a concerning population. So if we think about men and women, and often suicide data is expressed as a binary of male and female, we do see more men than women die by suicide. But the counting process that's happening in Australia right now is going to shift, and we're going to see a greater understanding and expression of those numbers for LGBTIQ plus communities, for example. So there are some good activities happening across Australia to try and get a better handle, better fix on diverse communities and diversity.
But over the past century, is it the case that we've had peaks and valleys as far as those rates are concerned?
You will see that. You will see shifts, and some of that is being attributed to the social determinants of suicide. So if I was to, think about, what are some of the big trends that are becoming much more discussed and considered and probably understood in the right way, that would be the social determinants of suicide. So unemployment is a key one, financial stress, interpersonal violence, domestic violence and alike. They're becoming a lot clearer. So we can begin to think about some of these mega trends, if you like, around that and understanding of suicide data.
And I think those things certainly stand out a lot in the news of late. Some of the things you just mentioned, so our housing crisis is very obvious, domestic violence is very obvious at the moment as well. What sort of an impact does that have when that's so front and centre?
That's a very good question, and I'll give you a broad sort of sweep of the impacts. I guess the first thing is that those impacts can prompt people to think that there are difficulties in life and life is just too hard. And those impacts can be seen to be unendurable and insurmountable. There seem to be challenges with housing, secure financial provisions for family and provisions for oneself.
And people feel hopeless because it's beyond their control.
Well, they might be out of their sphere of influence, but what we're noticing is that at a response level, there's a more attention being given to how we can address some of those social determinants. And I'm going to call them drivers, so think of them as drivers. And this is the second part where it gets a little bit complex, but very important and probably a good development in the field of suicidology. It's about how we support people not to act on those drivers. So the ever-present nature of things that seem to be insurmountable, unendurable, and the feelings that go with that, or the thoughts that go with that, I'm a burden to myself, I'm a burden to other people, I feel boxed in by my circumstances, I don't have the sense of belonging or sense of community and connection that's important to me. So the drivers can, for many people, progress to a more difficult and perhaps boxed in sense of being. And that's when we have to look more carefully at supporting people, and human connection, personal safety, things like that are absolutely top of the list. And there's lots of ways that can be expressed through community, not just in healthcare, but outside of healthcare is part of that process.
So there's the drivers themselves, there's people having these thoughts, being aware of these difficulties, but then there's people acting on them. And is it the case that it's pretty well impossible and not necessarily something you'd want for people to not be aware of their surroundings and their situation and the things that affect their lives? That's going to happen, but giving them the tools to be able to survive those times where the chips are down or see a future. And what we hear about a lot on this show is when people become suicidal, they can't see a way out of that when it's snowballing and they're caught up in a tornado with all this happening, and not being able to see past that and see that things will return to equilibrium and get better. It just feels like it's never going to change. So equipping people to be able to know that the dust is going to settle.
Yes, and suicidologists think of this in slightly different ways. So, but they're all, when I think about them, all connected ways, able to be able to mitigate the onset and worsening of some of these drivers, to be able to receive the support, to be able to disentangle some of these really powerful, overwhelming, but intersecting elements in somebody's life. And then, of course, to be able to have a sense of connection with other people. So when we begin to think about suicide prevention now, we're thinking about it much more about human connection and being together. And often when I meet with my suicidologist colleagues and we talk about these things in sometimes intimate discussions, it always comes down to human connection. So what is it that ultimately helps a person get through, whether that's in a health context or whether that's in a social context or a community context? It's that sense of connection where I, for example, in my work, try to encourage people who are supporting people in critical moments of the suicide experience to work towards a situation where the person feels felt by the worker. So just think about that for a minute, think about that language. Work towards a situation where they feel felt by the worker, but also have in conscious play how drivers of distress and what might be right for the person. So how do we help mitigate and prevent these drivers and create safety for you and bring comfort, reduce burdensomeness, improve sense of belonging. So, sense of belonging, thinking of it as a vital mental health concept. And in that interaction, how do we do that so that at the onset of or worsening of suicide-related distress, somebody has a place that they can go or things that they can do, people that they can talk to, ways that they can get through their suicidal urges, and in another way, I guess you could say that.
Are we doing better with connection?
I think we're doing better in connection in a couple of ways, but I still think we've got a long way to go. I think the COVID era probably taught us about the importance of that, and there was a rapid and national shift towards electronic forms of connection and the importance of that. And we've got a lot better, and I think a lot of projects that were fast-tracked to be able to address COVID and work carefully with communities and individuals, I think has been a good thing. But at another level, I think we've got a long way to go about connection, and it's probably about authentic connection and being able to enter into helping relationships or health relationships that are truly authentic, and we can work through those issues, spend time with somebody, be able to support that person. And I don't say that as a criticism of my colleagues working in healthcare, but I say that recognising that healthcare, contemporary healthcare, emergency healthcare, is under a lot of pressure. So we've got the things like in South Australia, the Urgent Mental Health Care Centre, we've got ED alternatives that are coming through, the Medicare locals, that's not just in South Australia, but nationally as well, that are really designed to get around some of those sort of traditional ED type pressures. Suicide safe spaces is another example of that. So we're getting better, but we still have further work to do. And I think the lived experience movement has helped us get there to where we are. If I were to think about how lived experiences made that contribution, certainly what I think they've done is they've helped us understand more of the qualitative phenomena of suicide-related distress.
Or humanising it.
Humanising it, absolutely. So less use of restrictive practices. So if you go to the Urgent Mental Health Care Centre in South Australia, you'll see a lounge chair. You won't see a brush, and you will not see a mattress on the floor, which is what you will see in some emergency departments around Australia.
And it's such a complex issue, but you can almost bring it back to needing to make people feel heard.
Yes, that's right. We want people to listen rather than listen to respond. So it's a different kind of listening, and that's a deep listening. But we also want to be aware and conscious in supporting a person for these wider, broader things, the social determinants that I mentioned earlier, and have those in conscious play.
So we started off by mentioning that suicide rates are increasing in various demographics. In others, they're staying the same. Wouldn't call that good news. What progress has been made in suicide prevention in the past decade?
So the progress has been made in a couple of areas. One is the better understanding of fluctuating states of suicide-related distress. So what I mean by that is fluctuating states of thoughts about suicide, but also things that I can do right now to be able to create safety. And we know this from very fine-grained ecological studies of suicide and critical moments of the suicide experience, So that has helped us to understand safety planning. And what I'm talking about when I mention safety planning is a truly personalised way of getting through difficult moments, things that I can do for myself, things that I can do right now, people I can talk to, situations that are safer, really fine-grained things that I can do.
That people are being guided to set up for themselves.
In a co-designed way. So a typical safety plan would normally be a 40 to 45 minute conversation. It doesn't need to be once off conversation in 45 minutes. It can be broken up into 2 or 3 bits. But that's where deep listening to listen rather than listening to respond, has a real place in my view. So that's one area that we're getting a lot better at. The other area, which I know in South Australia is set to change, is better aftercare, better support for people after a crisis. And that's something that I know the Health Department, in fact, this week have released public consultation on. So they've drafted, if you like, a pathway for best practice and sent it for public consultation just this week. And that's a very positive step in the right direction. We would be the first state in Australia, state or territory in Australia, to have taken this step. And I think that's a very good thing. There'll be all eyes and all ears from other states seeing how that's done. Similarly, the Suicide Prevention Act, creating more of a conversation, bringing suicide more publicly into conscious play. That's a first for South Australia, so that's not something that exists elsewhere. So straight off the bat, there are 3 or 4 things that I think are extremely positive. Elevating the convo, I guess is what you could say, elevating the conversation around.
And on that, we hear so much more about mental health and suicide now than we ever did. How does that impact the public's perception of its prevalence?
So there are 2 things about that. One is it brings these very difficult moments into public view in a safe way. And the safe way bit is kind of the second thing, because we still need to be careful about when and where and by what means. And the reason for that is that there's science that tells us that for some people that could activate the suicide mode.
So talking about details of attempts and not using the right language, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we're settled on that now. So we know that for some people in the community, that will be a very difficult moment for them. That could put them into a critical state, which nobody would want to see happen. But talking about it and opening up those conversations in safe ways, like we're doing here today, like we will see, I think, in many examples of in mainstream media, I think it brings suicide out of the shadows. It reduces stigma around help seeking, but importantly, it reduces stigma around help offering. So what we might offer our family, a member of our family, or a colleague at work. So a lot of these conversations about psychological safety, psychosocial job stressors, thinking about the circumstances we're in at work or at home or in the community, I think overall reducing stigma, public stigma, and making conversations easier, certainly about help offering, but help seeking as well. Yeah.
And it can make it seem like mental illness and suicide is all around us. It certainly seems like it's a case that it has to be a good thing that we're talking about mental illness and mental health, and we're learning about it, and we are more and more aware of suicide and also how to prevent it. And one side of the coin is it's more in your face, so it can feel like it's everywhere. It feels like things are getting worse. But I think of it like, well, imagine if we didn't have any conversation, and imagine if we weren't moving forward in this regard. You can bet that there would still be a lot of suicide happening, and there'd be similar, if not more, rates of mental illness, but with even more stigma attached, and it's still having not moved forward at all. And part of it being so difficult, hearing about it all the time, is a necessary growing pain, because at least we're acknowledging it. We're not just sweeping it under the rug, because as we know, if you just sweep it under the rug, it doesn't mean it's not there.
And people will tell us that when they're understood and when their story is understood, their actions are clearer. So we explain our actions through our stories. So if we open up that dialogue, if we have conversations about these things that are important to people, it makes it easier for us to be understood at work or at home or in our community. And that's a very good thing. I think what we also know is that asking about these questions demystifies them, and that makes those conversations easier as well. And we're all human. We all have our own vulnerabilities, our frailties, our difficult days, our better days. And I think that conversation of understanding the human condition are also a lot easier. The core is about acceptance, and I think the core is also about creating a sense of belonging within those communities that we have these conversations, but also demystifying and destigmatizing what is really part of the human condition.
Yeah, and it feels like we're doing better at that there's not, okay, over here's the mentally ill, sick people who are too weak to be able to handle the stresses of life, and then over the other side is everyone else who's fine. I think there's more of an understanding and appreciation that actually we're all human and we exist on a spectrum.
That's right. And for some people, when I'm not having a particularly good day, I might have a good day and another day. So it might be 60% of me today or 70% of me today. But on other days when things are going well, the circumstances are that I'm not in a static spot, in other words. So I have some good days and some days that, are less so.
And that's got to be all of us, I would think.
And that's my point. It's like everybody's story. It could happen to anybody, and it happens in families. It happens in our work colleagues. And so all of this conversation we're having today, these wider conversations are about acceptance, are about compassion, but they're also about the strengths that have got you to where you are today.
The difference being how many bad days are you having, how bad are they, and what skills and tools do you have at your disposal to be able to get past them and get to some better days.
That's right. And to create that space and have that hope and that compassion to have those conversations. So it comes down to that human connection to be able to open up those conversations. Yeah.
This is partly a gendered issue, mental health. We know it's different for men than it is for women and people in general. And we see that women self-harm and attempt more frequently than men do, yet men die at a much higher rate. What are the reasons for that?
There are a lot of complex reasons around that. And in some ways it may be the circumstances surrounding each of those events. But there are also circumstances where the ability or the space, the headspace that somebody's in at that particular time to be able to reach out and lift that telephone, make that call, be connected with somebody is a lot easier. So for some men, stoicism, self-reliance, being able to get through or not being able to ask that question for help because of a perception. So there are complex reasons, but there are also some headline elements to those complex reasons.
I've heard it said before that women are more likely to attempt as more of a cry for help, perhaps knowing that it's not actually going to result in them dying, whereas men will take a more final action and not tell anyone about it.
Yeah, they're words that I wouldn't use, because I take a view that all actions come from a place of distress, and whether that distress progresses to a catastrophic place or whether that's distress that is of a shorter term and of a safer nature, it is a form of distress. So some of those dimensions of understanding distress and gender differences are all part of that conversation.
And how does a previous attempt impact the likelihood of a future attempt?
That's a very good question, and one of the big things that we're conscious of now is aftercare, and particularly the support that people have. So there's a number of large-scale research projects that have been able to point us to the importance of aftercare and follow-up and support, a safety plan, family and carer involvement where that is possible, as being, if you like, the right foundations to be able to go forward. So reducing the risk, the overall risk of further difficulties or recurrence of that crisis in the future, And I think we're getting better at that. So the document from the Office of the Chief Psychiatrist that was released this week is focused on that as well, about best practice to be able to support people after a suicide-related crisis or a suicide-related event, and how to do that in the best possible way when people interact with the health system. So I think we're getting better, and we will be leading the way in South Australia.
So ideally, what sort of support should people receive, and what do they get now if you come out of hospital?
Sure. So safety planning is absolutely critical in the care and comfort of people after a suicide-related crisis, and that's the safety planning of a comprehensive nature, sitting down side by side to be able to work out what can we learn from this experience with the onset and worsening of suicidal urges or suicide-related distress. What are the things that we can do to be able to mitigate that, prevent that, take action, things that I can do for myself, things that involve maybe other people, right through to emergency rescue, and have that clearly articulated.
And who's the individual doing that with?
That could be with family, that could be with a peer worker, a lived experience worker, that could be with a clinician, a general practitioner, and that is critical. We know now, our team have investigated this on numerous occasions to know that that is effective. And most of the pilot work, most of the early developmental work around that was with military veterans, people who have had combat experience. So that's critical. And connection, ongoing connection, and helping the person to live a life with meaning and purpose. So the second area, second key part of this is having reasons for living. And the whole concept of reasons for living is built around the idea of when we have reasons for living, and when we're clear about that, we're less likely to take actions that put our reasons for living at risk or threaten those reasons for living. And reasons for living could be about going back to school, finishing year 12, it could be about going to university, getting married one day, having children, getting my car back on the road. It could be about things that are in my home. It could be a whole range of things. And reasons for living and living a meaningful life are incredibly important in the aftercare.
Could be seemingly smaller things that then build into bigger things, but finding reasons for living, particularly if you've been in that situation where perhaps you've just had a suicide-related event, that's not an easy thing to do, and certainly not by yourself. So like when people come out of hospital, do they get immediate access to a psychologist that they can then go back and see, or do they have to go on a wait list? How does that work?
So there are definitely still challenges, I know, in South Australia, and if not nationally, with those kinds of aftercare opportunities and appointments. However, there's more of an understanding of what is effective, what are the steps that are going to be important, the supports that are available, the support that's needed. And we're getting better at accessing those supports, not necessarily in a face-to-face context, but online supports or virtual supports through the various networks that are available. All of these things are getting a lot better.
And what's the recovery rate like? What do we see from people who've been in this situation and then months later, years later, how do they do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the further the distance out, the greater the recovery strengths. So there is data that's available which talks about the critical 12 months after a crisis event, and that being, to have those supports in place. But the further we go out, and the further and more deeply supports for physical health, mental health, addressing the social determinants that I spoke about earlier, the greater the ability, the capacity, and the likelihood for a strength-based recovery, to be able to come to a new place or come to a slightly different place to where you were, some similarities, but maybe some different places as well. And having hope for the future is part of that process.
And is that an overwhelming majority of people who do end up being able to recover and find a reason and move on?
Yes, so whilst we've been talking about suicide, it's quite a rare event in actual fact. So if we think about the numbers of people who die by suicide, and I do stress that the behind each of those numbers is a human being, is a mother, a father, a son or a daughter, a cousin, a nephew. Despite that, the numbers, it's still quite a rare event at a population level, catastrophic as it is, but it's still quite a rare event.
Yeah, I think the last data was something like 12 in 100,000 people.
Yeah, so suicide is counted per 100,000. That's right, so that's not uncommon. To 12, that range of say 11.9 to 12.5, and there are state-by-state variations where the rates are much higher in the Northern Territory. For example, in South Australia, I think we're about fourth on the table, or thereabouts.
How many people are chronically suicidal versus people who are suicidal at one point and they do or don't make it through that?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. Yeah, the short answer to that is we don't know. So we know, what we know about suicide is primarily through health contacts. So different events related to suicide, the counting of suicide we will have through sort of formal measures, if you like, or formal contacts with Health and Human Services. But then there are many people who have different events and crises that do so outside of a healthcare relationship or in a community context that we don't.
And they're not reporting it, so it's a difficult thing to track.
And that's right. So a lot of the information that we have, in fact, all of the information that we have is, when it's counted in our national data sets, is really through these touch points, what we would call touch points, if you like. But yes.
So you'd like to know that?
I think suicidologists would say yes. I think they would say, look, it's always good to know the nature and scope of a problem. It's good to understand its dimensions in different contexts, and metropolitan or rural, across the lifespan, at different stages, around different critical events. So I think a lot of people would say yes, that could be very helpful information, because it also might tell you what people are doing to be able to get through those difficult moments. What are they maybe doing and finding within themselves? Might link to reasons for living, might link to distraction or getting through right now. So there may in fact be some other additional things that are strength-based that we can point to.
And you mentioned it's not just the person, it's family, it's friends, it's the community. So we know that around 7 million Australians have had a loved one who's either died by suicide or who has attempted suicide. How does bereavement affect the people who are left behind in terms of their own suicide risk and their own mental health?
Yeah, so the numbers, in terms of impact and in terms of understanding numbers, they've been revised in recent times. So the latest figure, which is often the most cited one or the most credible one, is for each suicide event or loss by suicide, up to 135 people are impacted. And here's the thing, the degree of impact across that group of 135 for a particular individual in that 135 depends on the sense of psychological closeness that they had towards the person who died. So that's probably the most credible figure that we would know about, and as I say, is often cited in the literature. And the event is similar to sudden death through other forms of trauma, workplace accident or motor vehicle accident. And certainly you will have some similarities with grief and loss, the suddenness of that. There's other experiences about, what could I have said, or what could have been done by me, or did I miss something? And these are really difficult moments, complex grief that's associated with suicide loss. And then there are wider implications that have been reported. So I've heard of people who have lost a loved one to suicide, an immediate family member to suicide. They've seen somebody walking up the street, approaching them. That person has crossed the street and walked on the other side rather than interact with the person who's been bereaved by suicide. So there are some really complex areas. That's an area that I think we need to know and understand better, but also an area that we need to have a really good coordinated support for across not just Australia, but I would say in South Australia. I think that's an area of development, it's an area of need, and it's something that I'm particularly interested in.
Does the research say that people who've been bereaved are at higher risk themselves?
There is data that suggests that people who have been bereaved by suicide do have an elevated risk of suicide. So that is true, but it's mitigated by all of these things that we can do and have available: the knowledge of community, the connection with family, workplace connection, support, ongoing comfort and support, all of these things that we can put in place, and sharing and talking about what's happening, what's going on. These things are all part of that process. Yeah.
And you mentioned a key difference, I think, between sudden death and suicide is that element of going over and over in your head what you could have said or what you could have done differently, and it's connected to a feeling of false guilt or shame around it's somehow my fault, versus if there was a random accident, you're probably not going to have that element where you think you could have done something about it. And that's, in my experience, the men that I've spoken to, something that people can really struggle with even years later, just not being able to truly accept, even if they can logically accept that it wasn't their fault in any way and there's nothing that they could have done, part of them still chews them up over that. What can be done to help people in that scenario find relief?
That's a big area that people have started to look at very closely amongst health workers and people working in mental health in particular, supporting somebody who's going through a very difficult time, as a client or a patient, whatever the model of care might be, and losing that person so that the life has, that person has died whilst they're in treatment or in care. It is something that people have looked very carefully at. And often it's a close connection with the workplace supervisor, the peer support network that you have, knowing the limits of your own power and capabilities, personal reflection, and certainly taking good self-care. And for some people, they've extended out even further, met with the family, spoken with the family, understandably, shared the grief with the family, been able to talk things through. These are practices now which I'm certainly seeing in South Australia and I've seen elsewhere. And I guess it goes back to this very important discussion that we had earlier about opening up those conversations and being really human and kind to ourselves and kind to each other to be able to support people. For many years, I belonged to a small group of suicidologists that met every 2 years called the AESHI group, and we would meet in the United States. And for 2.5 to 3 days, this intimate group of around 50 suicidologists would discuss just these issues and share insights and reflections on these kinds of processes. And what I remember most from those particular discussions is the importance of good peer support, good connection with colleagues, and that's a mitigation against the rumination potentially, or other adverse or difficult processes that might follow a suicide death.
And what if it's someone in your own family, so not just someone that you've been closely connected to through work or someone who's not your family, but so one example I'm thinking of is a man who's been on this show who lost his brother when his brother was in his early 20s and he was too, and years on, still having a connection to him now. He still thinks about that every day, and he still thinks about what he could have done and knows logically that it's not his fault, but just can't fully get past that. And I got so much compassion for someone like him. Is going to therapy essential in that kind of context?
And people will express and work through their grief in various ways. And yes, some people will find comfort in being able to talk that through and make connection with what has happened and their memory of that person, their circumstances surrounding the person's death, the impact that it's had on them, all of the things that you've just mentioned. And perhaps for some others, they'll work through it in the way that you describe with a therapist, to be able to integrate this kind of loss and this new connection that they're making about understanding that loss into their life going forward, and being able to make meaning from all of that, and memorializing at various times, days of significance or times of the calendar events that relate to that particular person or circumstances and memories, and really building that in to going forward. And they're so personal and deeply intimate many times for people. And then across cultural groups, there'll be rituals and that might involve groups, so community-based rituals or groups that help memorialise somebody who's died by suicide. So I've seen differences, and certainly there's research in this area as well, which points to the potential benefits of different ways of memorialising.
And what are the most common drivers of suicide for young men in particular?
Well, what we know
that makes sense. What are the most common drivers of suicide for young men in particular?
I think at different stages there would be drivers at certainly at different stages of somebody's experience. But the key ones that we would think about in right now for that particular group. I'm going to start this again. Have a drink of water.
That's right. Have a sip. Yeah.
Yeah. Have a drink of water. Yeah. Good.
I might ask the question differently as well, actually.
All right. Yeah.
What's at the core of why so many men take their lives?
I think this is my answer to that is probably across all age groups, and it comes down to living a life with meaning, living a life that I want to live, a life that's right for me. And I know that might sound like a very straightforward statement in some ways.
There's a lot that goes into that, though, isn't there?
I think there's a lot that goes into that. Living the life that I want to live as a man, as a woman, as an older adult, or whatever the circumstances might be. Am I living the life that I want to live? In my 30 years of working in the field of suicidology, that has always been the standout for me. Am I living my life? Am I living a life that I want to live in the way that it's right for me? And when those challenges emerge in being able to do that, we can then begin to think about the potential trajectory from mental distress and being in circumstances at home or at work or in relationships or in community, and what those tensions are, how they drive different thought processes. So living an authentic life, living a life with meaning, living a life with purpose, being with the people that are right to be with, feeling safe, being with people you want to be with and they want to be with you, are so fundamental. And in the challenge that we have now is to be able to do that in the context of these broader social determinants around housing, secure employment, financial security, broader social determinants that we've been discussing today about relationships and so forth. That's when the challenges really do creep in.
So how does the lack of control and agency factor into that? Because it's one thing for people to want to live a certain way and have dreams and aspirations like we all do, and there's people who feel like it's within their power to make that happen, and there's a lot of people who feel like they're not able to for things that are beyond their control, and those two groups can switch back and forth. So how much does us feeling like we can actually be the ones to create that life we want factor into this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question and an important question to ask, because that's where having empowered communities, where empowered relationships, flexibility and choice in our working relationships, how our education system is running, in family relationships is also part of that process. And empowerment and choice, not just in words, but in true action, to be able to control those sorts of choices that we want to make, I think is really critical. Yeah.
So people feel like they don't have that agency because maybe their family expects them to live a certain way, or they're in a relationship where someone's being domineering and not allowing them to be who they need to be. Couple of examples. People who are in those kinds of circumstances, how can they reframe their thinking, or what's a first step that they might be able to take?
We've published on this just recently, looking at a group of people in the community who, for complex reasons, can't be the authentic person that they know that they are, for complex cultural reasons, for example. And so how are they working through that, and how are they finding their peace to be able to do that? And one of the findings from that piece of work was around having confidence. Having confidence, and we think of confidence as a mental health protective factor, sense of belonging as a mental health protective factor, being able to find ways to be able to preserve particular family relationships and constructs that are important for other reasons, but navigating other relationships which are going to be protective and promotive of mental health.
As many as 1 in 3 Aussies report feeling lonely. How does loneliness fit in with this story?
Yes, loneliness, that's a very interesting area, and something that there's been a spotlight on, not just in South Australia and nationally, but globally. Loneliness amongst men at different transition points in some cases, but more broadly, loneliness as a health impact. So loneliness at its most difficult, I'm going to start this again. For some people, loneliness is the equivalent of 7 cigarettes a day. And the 7 cigarettes a day impact is around physical health, lack of mobility, gaining weight, not exercising, cardiovascular impacts are all part of the 7 cigarettes a day.
So is there a physical manifestation to loneliness?
Yes, most definitely a physical manifestation. So a change in diet, not having social contact, not getting out and about, can impact upon, muscle development, muscle growth, gaining weight, so obesity and being overweight, cardiovascular impacts, the onset of diabetes, a whole range of things.
And that's an example of how we feel being reflected in how we look and how we act.
That's right. And in some parts of the world, in the parliament, they have a minister for loneliness, somebody who's in fact got loneliness in their spotlight as something that they want to address in all policy fronts. So all portfolio areas should have a loneliness consideration. So I'm thinking of the United Kingdom, for example, where that's the case. But loneliness is a real challenge. Being together with other people, the benefits of interaction, to counter all of that loneliness is a hot button issue. And what we know is that most effective programs for loneliness are the ones that the person is addressing the issues that they're dealing with, they're finding to be the most challenging, rather than a program that's imposed on a person. So we might think we have good intentions to be able to instigate a program or bring a person into a program, but it's actually the opposite. The program needs to be driven by the person, where they're at, what their needs are, what their challenges are, what their aspirations may be about changing the circumstances that they're in.
So what does it look like for someone who's lonely? They think, I'm alone a lot, because there's being alone and there's being lonely, and they're not the same thing, because there's a lot of us like to have some space to ourselves as well, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need that too. But then loneliness is a different kettle of fish, because well, how do you describe it? Is it a feeling? Is it a state of being?
A feeling where you don't have a sense of connection to other people. So we could be in a group of people, having a meal together, a shared meal, or being in a cafe, or being out. But if I don't feel connected to them, I'm not going to experience a connection. If I don't have that connection, it's not going to be there for me to experience. So loneliness is that absence of that connection. So this goes back to some of these core fundamentals that we've touched on here today, and about human connection and the importance of connection. So it's the perception that the person has of being connected to other people, having meaningful engagement, meaningful activity, and a meaningful purpose, which reinforces this key finding in research that it's the perception for the person about what's right for them, using their language, their story, the metaphor that they may use, in fact, to be able to address their loneliness.
So if people feel like that, do they need to be around different people? Do they need a different community? Or does it start with them working on themselves to perceive? Because, it might be the fact that you feel lonely around your family, you can't just go get a different family. So there's working on yourself that goes with that too.
I think for all of these things, there are periods of self-reflection where that's possible. And there might be a stepped approach around self-reflection. It might be a staged or stepped approach towards moving towards a particular goal. So a conversation about goals, a conversation about, what's the ideal scenario if you were to do this or that? What's the best way forward as you see it? What are the steps to be able to take us to this point that you want to get to?
Knowing what you actually want.
Exactly.
And thinking about what might make you feel connected.
That's right. And
it might not be what someone else says will make you feel connected.
That's right. And all of this is about choices that are not forced choices. This is about choices that are right for the person, culturally, developmentally, socially, that's right for that person. That's fundamentally what's critical in these discussions about loneliness.
When we're talking about getting help, we know that despite popular belief, men actually do reach out for help. So how much does seeking help?
It's about the window of opportunity, how it's done, the critical moment when it happens. So is this the right time? And I often say to people, you may be the one. Even though we may have offered it 3, 4, 5 times, that moment of going back and being truly present and being open, staying connected with somebody might just be the moment, might just be the time. That could be at work, that could be in the community, that might be in a family context. And one of my foundations, what I do promote, is the idea of always staying connected, no matter how difficult, how tiring, how exhausting, how frustrating things may be, but to be really stay connected as best you can might just be the foundation that's needed to get your loved one and yourself through those very difficult times. It's something I've been promoting for some time, and I've stayed with that because I think it's very important.
I've heard Dr. Zach Seidler from Movember talk about before the fact that it's not so much the initial reaching out for help, that's getting better in some ways, but it's being able to retain men in particular and have them not only go try once and then stop, but actually come back again to the point where it actually becomes useful.
That's right. Yeah.
So
that's right.
What are we missing? Is that the services' fault that they're not accommodating men in the way that it needs to happen? What do you think goes into men not getting as much out of attending those services as we would hope that they would?
I think it's a combination of a range of things. I think it's a complex issue. So I think on the one hand that it can be what happens in that moment, what is said and done, what happens non-verbally even in the interaction between the person seeking assistance or the person in distress and what happens with the worker. I think that can be quite a powerful message for the person in distress potentially. But I think it also can be a sense of, for some people, I need to be self-reliant. I need to have stoicism. I need to be strong. I need to sort of be tough in this situation. So I'm not going to ask anybody for help, or a sense of perception that, I'm putting giving someone a difficult moment, a burden on that person, if you like, because of what I'm asking from them or what I'm needing from them. So there's a whole lot of complex things. Some of them are visible, some of them are transparent, some of them are felt very readily, and maybe some are less visible. So we don't have visibility on some of these processes. But if we are truly authentic and we can bring that authentic sense of self in as a responder, as a person working in health or human services, a person at work and person in the community, that foundation is a pretty solid one from which to build from. And people, in my experience, when they're in distress and facing difficult moments or having difficult conversations, they are looking for authentic responses and they're alert to it. And it goes back to some of those earlier comments about, work towards a situation where the person feels felt by you.
And hyper alert, because it's a vulnerable
For
scenario
some people,
where, as you've said, we're thinking about self-reliance, and it's taken a lot of courage to even get to that point. And your mindset could be, I'm getting judged, or waiting for that to happen,
right.
even though it's not the case. So,
I think for some people, yes, that's right. And I think for some people that's absolutely right. And if we're aware of that and we have that in conscious play, that's a good thing. It's a good, if you like, foundation place to be able to work from. I really do think these things are important.
Yeah. I have had a negative experience with the only psychologist I've been to after losing my friend to suicide, where on the second session they said that reincarnation is a proven fact and that my friend was going to come back as something else. And that felt like a real breach of my trust, having poured out a lot of emotions over those sessions, to then have what I would describe as to say that that's a foregone conclusion is a very kooky thing to say in my book anyway. So that really put me off and was quite upsetting. And I haven't gone back since, but actually booked in to see another psychologist. I'm doing that not because I'm particularly distressed at this point. I think life's actually going pretty well, but I know that there's plenty of things that I've been through, as we all have by the time I'm the ripe old age of 30 now, where I could definitely get some benefit out of talking to someone who's objective and qualified about that. And on the self-reliance point of view, I see it as a way to make me self-reliant. I think that's how we should think about it, where it's like, if I can go and sharpen these tools and get these skills and get the language and break some of these things down, that's actually going to make me more capable of being self-reliant as life goes on. It's not an example that I'm not self-reliant now. Yeah.
Interesting story, and I think a valuable one in lots of ways, because it is about the right connection. And in session 2, is clearly out of scope. That's not going to work for you. That had all the indications that that's not how you want to be considered or responded to, and it makes perfect sense for you to say, no, that's not for me.
I think there's an average of 4 or 5 different people it takes before we find the person who suits us.
That's right. And I think that's a really important point. And to be able to have that, and it's got to feel right, it's got to be right. It is critical.
And that's a big ask, because when we're talking about an average of 3 to 6 months to get in to see someone, if they don't work for you, and then it's back to the drawing board of waiting again, it can be tough for people to keep trying as well. But I suppose the message would be that it is worth it, because once you find someone who you do connect with, that can make a huge difference to your life. And I've certainly heard a lot of stories of people finding that therapist, and that continues to be life-changing for them.
That's right, and it is literally life-changing, and something that they can carry forward in life.
How much of that wait time, the 3 to 6 months, is a lack of clinicians, and how much of it is not enough of a focus on preventative health in our society?
There are different views on this, and certainly for some professions there are wait times, there are lengthy wait times, and that might be for an initial consultation, what we call an IC, or that may be extensive wait times for ongoing therapy and processing and working on particular issues. There are really good resources that are available, online resources through the Head to Health process, the Commonwealth Government process. I highly recommend those, where there can be some short-term plans in the interim. So if there is a wait, there may be a plan there that you can engage with. You can speak to somebody about following an online, filling out an online form and doing some, answering some questions online, if you like.
And what might they get from doing that?
So an interim plan, a way forward that can hold them over, for want of a better term, until that appointment time or that ongoing series of appointments becomes possible.
And would people get that from their GP or the practice
No, that's
itself?
free, that's online, so you can go online and do that, and then you can speak to somebody afterwards. The important thing is that, and this is true for many of these services that we often hear about, highly credible, thoughtful, carefully constructed, evidence-based, so right through to the crisis lines like Lifeline and others, highly credible organisations that can provide support.
To your mind, how much is preventative health part of this whole picture, and arming people, equipping people along that spectrum to be able to avoid ending up in crisis in the first place, right back to our government and our society funding those kinds of initiatives and not just putting all the funding at the crisis end, which of course is crucial, but the rest of the picture. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a big place for strength-based mental health and suicide prevention. And I use the term strength-based because we want to build on what is strong rather than what is wrong. So if we think about what is strong, what we can do now, how we can get through right now, what are the strengths, what are the things that have got me through to this point right now, and being able to build on those, I think that is an important step forward. Now that's physical and mental health. That's across the lifespan. That's across different contexts of getting through right now. So that's about family, that's about things that I can do for myself, that's about my connection that I may have, that's about getting through some bad news or difficult news that I've had to deal with in my family or in my personal life, who has helped me to be able to meet those challenges, who I trust to be able to talk to be able to get through those things. I mean, these are things for everybody, not just people with physical and mental health challenges, things that they have to address.
Yeah, it's about being human.
It's about being human, and that is fundamentally the big story here, that all of these things are part of the human condition and can help us, as I say, from a strength-based perspective.
And I think there's a big role to play for sports clubs, but grassroots initiatives and micro communities in supporting themselves and having that strong supportive culture within their own group, and the impact that can have, and sort of the teaching a man to fish approach, where there's all these little groups everywhere that connect to people's lives in various ways, and how do we strengthen those cultures within those clubs and those communities so that they can look after their own, who they see 3 times a week.
And I think there's a good consensus about that now. I think not just in Australia, but globally, I think there's a strong consensus about the value, the significance and the benefits of all of that. And equally, there's a strong consensus about the need for proper tertiary care services or specialist services to be able to provide specialist support if and when it's needed.
And people who've been let down by the mental health system or the lack of services that they've been able to get on top of, they might say the system's broken, and with a bit of a sense of helplessness, nothing's going to change because the powers that be don't actually care about my life or making things better, and the same thing's just going to keep on happening. Is the system broken?
I think parts of the healthcare system are broken, and in the way that we have long wait times, real challenges for people to be able to get services on time, that every door needs to be the right door, not the wrong door, but the right door to be able to get through that. And I think people are aware of that. I think our politicians at a state level and nationally are really aware of that. I think people on the ground are aware of that too, across the lifespan, in the child adolescent space right through to the adult space. I want to give you the message that it's not a story without its successes as well, of being able to support people and be able to get people into safe and comfortable spaces, particularly in mental health crises. And that I have seen, and we are seeing still.
Yeah, so there's a lot of reason for optimism, and it's not the case that it's a broken system that's not trying to fix itself and isn't making improvements in other areas and just staying stagnant and accepting that.
Correct, yeah. There are a lot of very good people in healthcare. I meet them in the work that I do, but there's always work to be done. There's, in my world, the next generation of health workers, health and human service workers that we want to be able to graduate from universities in health and human services and nursing, for example, to be the best version of themselves that they can in healthcare.
So you've been around this for a long time now. Are we going the right direction.
We are going the right direction. I believe we're going the right direction because we're better informed, we're better aware of wider trends. We're also going in the right direction because I think we're more accountable than at any other time. We're more accountable for our practice, there's more scrutiny, and I think those things are also pointing us in the right direction.
And not only accountable, but it seems that we care more.
I think that's true. I think we do care more, yeah.
Well, Nicholas, thanks so much for your time today. I know you're a very busy man, and I really appreciate your insight into these topics that we can talk about in a different sort of depth, and I hope it's offered people some understanding that perhaps they didn't have before. So thank you so much. It's very valuable.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
That's it for this episode. If you like what we're all about, support us by following Youngblood Men's Mental Health on Instagram and Youngblood Mental Health on TikTok. Every podcast episode is recorded in professional quality video, and they're all up on our Youngblood Men's Mental Health YouTube channel. So please show some love and subscribe. Thanks to our local business supporters, Pro Realty Property Consultants. You can find everything there is to know about the podcast at youngbloodmensmentalhealth.com. And most importantly, please share these stories with anyone in your life who needs to know they're not alone. We're all in this together. Catch you next time.